On Sky Vista Airlines Flight 482, the peaceful atmosphere suddenly became heavy. A flight attendant asked two black brothers, Devin Carter, a newly promoted architect, and Alyssa Carter, a sociology doctor, to switch seats with a white passenger, simply because she wanted to sit next to her husband. From row 14, everyone's eyes were on them, as if waiting to see how they would react. Devin said nothing. He simply picked up the phone and dialed a familiar number, Sky Vista's emergency line. The cabin fell silent as the seconds ticked by. Someone swallowed. A storm of justice was brewing, not with a shout, but with calm. In those few short minutes, every prejudice, every privilege, every contemptuous glance was suspended in mid-air, waiting for an unexpected reversal. What do you think will happen when silence speaks? Like, share this video, and subscribe to the channel to join us in the story where justice does not need to be heard by shouting. The Sky Vista Airlines Boeing 737 shook slightly as it began to taxi onto the runway. The afternoon light streamed through the window, illuminating the face of Devin Carter, a black man in his 30s, with a calm face, but eyes that held something that not everyone had the serenity of someone who knew his own worth. Beside him, his sister, Alyssa Carter, a PhD in sociology, was buckling up. She smiled and said softly, "After the party in Phoenix, I have to go back to Stanford." Devin nodded and replied softly, "And I have to finish the design for the Eastfield Community Center. Dad will be proud." There was a quiet intimacy between them, a simple joy as they both received good news in their careers. They were flying home to celebrate their parents' 50th wedding anniversary, a journey of love and steadfastness. As they had learned from their parents, don't let anyone tell you you're inferior, even by looking at them. The plane stopped for a few minutes at Gate 12, and passengers boarded more slowly than usual. The cabin was filled with the sounds of suitcase straps, children asking, "Are we flying yet?" and the smell of coffee from the front of the cabin. Everything seemed normal until Marianne, the economy flight attendant, walked up to row 14. She seemed orderly, her voice dry and slightly high. "Excuse me, Mr. Carter, I need you to switch seats with another passenger." Devin looked up politely. "Is there a problem?" Miss Marianne tilted her head, trying to maintain a businesslike smile. "Yes, there is a passenger, Mrs. Langford, who would like to sit next to her husband in business class. Your seats are the closest available in the connecting area. If you could move to row 24, we would appreciate it." Alyssa frowned slightly. "We reserved these seats over a month ago," she said, her voice soft but clear. "We need to sit next to each other. I'm afraid we can't change them." Marianne curled her lips, then whispered just enough for them to hear. She was a little annoyed to find out she had to sit behind the others. "I hope you understand." Silence. Devin looked straight at her. "Did you say others?" Marianne looked slightly confused. "I mean, other passengers. It's nothing serious." But Alyssa heard clearly, and from behind Marianne, Mrs. Langford, the white woman in the jade green dress, let out a sentence that was half sigh, half contempt. "These people, always making things difficult." The whisper was like a drop of ink falling into a glass of clear water. Not loud, but enough to change everything. A few nearby passengers looked up. A young couple exchanged confused glances. The engine continued to roar, but the air in the cabin suddenly became thick. Alyssa took a deep breath. She felt the blood rush to her face, but her mother's voice in her head rang out again. "Not every war needs explosions. My daughter." Devin placed a hand gently on his sister's arm, signaling for silence. He flipped open his phone, pressed a few buttons, and held it to his ear. A calm voice rang out. Clearly, "Hello, this is Devin Carter, passenger on Sky Vista Flight 482 Row 14A. I would like to report an incident of discriminatory behavior to our Special Passengers Department." Mary Ann stood speechless for a moment. The whole cabin seemed to hold its breath. Devin kept his voice light as if reading a blueprint. "A flight attendant is asking us to give up our seats to other passengers because they feel uncomfortable sitting behind people like us. I want the airline to know about this now, while the plane is still on the ground." No one said anything. Mary Ann paled and tried to interject. "Mr. Carter." "I think you misunderstood Devin," interrupted with a faint smile. "If I'm wrong, this call will prove it." The voice from the phone rang out loud enough for several people nearby to hear. "We have noted it. Please stay in touch. Dispatch will contact the captain shortly." Mary Ann took a step back. She felt the passengers' eyes on her. No one raised their voices. No one shouted. But the atmosphere, the tense silence. Devin's calm gaze made her feel as if she had stepped into the cold. "Mrs." Langford stood behind. Her lips pursed, about to say something. But her husband, who was sitting in the front compartment, turned his head and gave a slight signal for silence. He seemed to realize that the situation was getting out of hand. A middle-aged passenger sitting in row 15, Mr. Howard Ellis, watched the scene with a thoughtful look. This elderly white man had the calm air of someone who had lived through decades of change in America. He spoke softly, enough for Alyssa to hear. "Sometimes, just one person standing still is enough to make the whole system reflect on itself." Alyssa turned to look at him, a smile flickering across her face for the first time. At the front of the cabin, Mary Ann turned awkwardly back to the service counter. She pulled out the intercom, spoke quickly into it, and then fell silent. Devin hung up, set the phone down on the table. His eyes no longer angry, just the calm of someone who knows he's in the right place. His sister said softly, "What do you think they'll do? I don't know," he replied softly. "But whatever happens, we won't leave our place." The plane had not yet taken off, but in the cabin, one had the feeling of having just undergone a moral test flight, where every look, every word, was a testimony to the way people faced each other. From row 14, silence became a language. It filtered through the corridor, echoing in the minds of each passenger. Some shook their heads, some sighed, and here and there, someone pursed their lips in thought. In just a few minutes, the Carter brothers had slowed down the entire flight, not because of technical issues, but because of moral issues. 3 hours before the incident in row 14, Devin and Alyssa had thought this would be a peaceful flight, a flight home, where they planned to celebrate with a small gift for their parents. Neither of them knew that this peaceful moment would be the beginning of a test of character, intelligence, and how people deal with prejudice. 3 hours ago, the Seattle sky was still misty, the asphalt roads lit by morning lights. On the 28th floor of Kensington and Row Architects, Devin Carter stood at the window, looking down at the waking city. On his desk was a thick envelope printed with the words "Partnership Confirmation," effective immediately. He opened it a third time, though he knew every word. The ink and paper were unchanged, but the feeling was the same, both quiet and profound. Not joy, but relief, like someone who had traveled a long way and finally arrived. The phone rang. Alyssa called. "Are you on your way? I just locked my computer." "How about you folding clothes?" Mom texted. "Don't forget Dad's anniversary present." Devin laughed. "The wooden frame you bought at the artisan market, yeah?" I'll tell them it's a generational bridge. I hope they get the message. Alyssa Carter, a sociologist with a Ph.D., has just been offered a position as director of Stanford University's Center for Community and Social Equity. She hasn't told anyone but her brother, not out of modesty, but because she believes the most important things need to be shared at the right time, with the right people. That morning, the two brothers met at SeaTac Airport. Alyssa pulled a small suitcase, her hair slightly curled, her white shirt, her appearance both casual and sturdy. Devin walked up, wearing a dark blue shirt, brown leather shoes, holding an old covered book in his hand, The Architecture of Empathy. "Do you still carry it with you?" Alyssa asked. "Yeah. I read it whenever the world gets too noisy." The two of them walked together to the check-in counter, unhurried, unpretentious, the way they moved slowly, yielding to the elderly, bowing to the ticket counter. Staff exuded the virtue their parents had taught them: when you carry respect, you never have to prove your worth. In waiting room, B12 soft light from large windows bathed rows of cold metal chairs. Alyssa opened her laptop to review a lecture she was about to give on social bias and unconscious language. Devin flipped through drawings of the community center. He was designing a structure centered on light, where everyone felt included. A deep voice came from the next row. "Public Works. I assume you are doing something for the city." Devin turned around and saw an old white man in a gray suit and silver-rimmed glasses. He was reading the Times folded in half. "Yes. I did the design for Eastfield. It wasn't a big project, but it was meaningful." "Eastfield?" He nodded. "I used to help a group of young people there when I was teaching law. Howard Ellis." Devin smiled and shook his hand. "Devin Carter. Nice to meet you." Alyssa looked up, tilting her head slightly. "You used to teach law?" "Yes, for many years. Now I'm just visiting my newborn great-granddaughter. Life. You know, it comes full circle, and then you learn to start over." The conversation flowed naturally between the three of them. They talked about the changing landscape of society, about how each generation views justice differently. Howard listened more than he spoke, but his words carried weight. When the loudspeaker announced that the flight to Phoenix was about to depart, Alyssa looked around and sighed softly. This world is really small. Sometimes, a meeting at the airport makes people believe that there is still hope. Howard smiled. Hope is never lost. It just gets tired sometimes, so it sits down to rest. The three of them boarded the plane. Mr. Howard happened to be right behind them in row 15C. He wished the two brothers a peaceful flight. Little did they know that just a few hours later, he would be the one to witness and change the course of an event that would leave the entire cabin breathless. On the chair, Devin opened a small handwritten card, a gift he intended to give his parents when he got home. It read, "Thank you for teaching us to build a house with patience and a life with dignity." Alyssa read, chuckling, "I think Dad will cry. He'll say he got dust in his eyes." They talked about their mother, a former nurse in hard times, who had educated two children with frugality and dignity, about their father, a former carpenter, who believed that everyone had a place, at the table, in a meeting, in society. "Do you remember the first time I got rejected for that architecture job?" Alyssa asked. Devin nodded. "They said they wanted someone who would fit the client. Mom hugged me and said, 'Fit isn't about the color of your skin, son. It's about how you hold your head when people look down at you.'" Alyssa smiled slightly. "I think Mom would be proud to see you now. I'm proud of you, too." In the middle of the conversation, the loudspeaker called for passengers one last time. Devon stood up and took the suitcase of an old lady in front of him. It was then that Alyssa noticed Mrs. Langford, the white woman talking loudly to her husband at the business class counter. She glanced at her, then ignored her. They boarded the plane and made their way to row 14. The flight had begun, but their journey was more than just from Seattle to Phoenix. It was also a journey from past to present, from the lessons their parents taught them about dignity, to the moment when those lessons would be put to the test. They both sat down, looking out at the silvery sky. "Do you think things will change?" Alyssa asked. "Yes. But not because the world wants it to, but because we keep reminding it that justice is still here." Alyssa nodded. Little did she know that in a few hours, those words would come true in the air, between glances and heavy silence. And so, when the takeoff announcement sounds, they close their computers, lean back in their seats, believing it's just a flight home. Little did they know that flight would become proof that silent justice sometimes does not need a court. It just needs two people to maintain their dignity in a sky full of prejudice. 3 hours earlier, before the Seattle sun had even crested the glass buildings, Devon and Alyssa had sat in the B-12 terminal, where the silver metal chairs reflected the weak early morning light. The steady drone of airport speakers mingled with the smell of coffee and the clatter of suitcases. The air was both still and distant, like the stillness before a great wind that no one noticed. Alyssa was rereading her draft of a speech for the upcoming Stanford Social Justice Conference. She highlighted a line. "Sometimes, to understand, you have to dare to sit down and listen to people who are different from you." She smiled. It sounded simple, but it took most of a lifetime to truly understand it. In the next row, Devon was scrolling through a drawing on his tablet, a semicircular community center building with a glass roof that let in natural light. He paused at the central courtyard, where he noted, "This space only makes sense if everyone feels welcome." A deep, low, yet clear voice spoke from behind. "Did you just say welcome? I like that word." Alyssa turned around. It was an old man with white hair, like threads, wearing a gray coat, holding an old leather-bound book in his hand. His eyes were bright, not the kind of bright that someone wanted to teach, but the kind that someone who had lived long enough to know that learning was a form of humility. Devon smiled. "Yes. I am planning a community center in Eastfield. I want it to be a place where everyone feels they have a place." The old man nodded. "Eastfield? I used to work with a group of law students there. You could say I have seen the world change, slowly but steadily. I am Howard Ellis." He held out his hand. Devon shook it, and Alyssa tilted her head and smiled. "I'm Alyssa, and this is my brother, Devon. Nice to meet you." Howard sat down in the chair opposite. "Where are you two going, Phoenix?" Devon replied. "My parents are celebrating their 50th wedding anniversary." 50 years. Howard chuckled. "Half a century of love. That's the most durable form of architecture, my friend." Alyssa laughed. It was part joke, part philosophy. Howard had a way of stating the obvious, something people often forget. Then he explained the reason for the trip I flew to Tucson to see my first great-grandchild. My daughter said, "Dad, her name is Ellis." So I had to go. "You taught law," Alyssa asked softly. "For 40 years. When I was young, I was involved in a human rights organization. Back then, America was still divided by race. It's less so now, but sometimes people still divide each other by looks." That statement made Alyssa silent for a moment. Devon looked at her and asked, "So what makes you believe that society is truly progressive?" Howard thought for a moment. His eyes turned to the glass doors, where the sunlight was growing warmer. When I see young people like you two sitting here, polite, confident, and without resentment, progress is not in rules, but in the way we look at each other." Alyssa looked at him, a smile slowly spreading across her face. "At Stanford, I teach about linguistic bias. But listening to you, I find that sometimes just changing your perspective can change the words." Howard tilted his head slightly. "And sometimes, just sitting next to each other. Do you know I once argued with a good friend for 2 years because we wouldn't sit at the same table one day? I invited him fishing. We never spoke again." Devin laughed. "Maybe the world needs more fishing, sir." "Or at least," Howard said, "more people willing to listen." A warm silence fell between them. No one said anything, only the loudspeaker calling passengers to board Sky Vista 482 to Phoenix. Howard stood up and straightened his coat. "We're on the same flight. I hope my seat isn't too far from you two. I like talking to people who listen." Alyssa smiled. "I hope you don't regret it, because we talked a lot." They walked through the departure gate together. In the crowded crowd, 3 people, 3 generations, 3 skin colors, walked side by side. No one knew that. Just a few hours later, this small encounter would become an invisible bond that would help the entire plane learn a lesson in dignity and understanding. On the plane, Howard sat right behind them, row 15C. Before fastening his seatbelt, he leaned forward and said softly, "Alyssa, I have an old teaching rule. If something makes you want to scream, try whispering it first. If it still sounds true in silence, it's worth saying." Alyssa looked at him and nodded, not knowing that a few hours later, those very words would echo in her mind, in the middle of a tense airplane cabin, when a woman uttered the words, "these people." The plane engine hummed softly, the light reflecting off the glass. The Seattle sky gradually receded behind him, and below, the city grew smaller, like a memory. Howard opened his notebook and wrote a few lines. Devin saw the first line, "Understand to live with, not to win." He smiled. "Some strangers show up just when you need a reminder." As for Alyssa, she leaned her head back against the seat and closed her eyes. In that moment between heaven and earth, she had no idea that the thread she had just sewn, a thin but strong thread, would be the one to hold justice to this entire flight. Because sometimes, just a kind conversation is enough to make the whole world stop and listen. The final announcement sounded. Passengers loaded their suitcases onto the deck. Devin let a young mother with a baby go first, and Alyssa helped an elderly man fold his cane beside his seat. They were the kind of people you could trust calm, courteous, knowing where they were and not needing to prove it. Sky Vista Flight 482 was about to take off. Inside the cabin, the light from the pale yellow lamps shone down on the rows of gray leather seats. Row 14 was located at the boundary between 2 cabins, half business class, half premium economy. Devin had once joked about this special location. This place is like the boundary between 2 worlds. Alyssa laughed, not knowing that in a few minutes, her words would become bitterly true. The sound of high heels echoed down the aisle. Mary Ann, the head stewardess, appeared with a standard smile and a brisk walk. Behind her was Mrs. Langford, a white woman in her 60s, wearing a jade green coat and a shiny pearl necklace. Her face showed no anger, but her eyes held an invisible power, the kind of familiarity that takes precedence. "Excuse me," Mary Ann said, her voice soft but cold. "I need to speak to 2 passengers in row 14. Devin looked up. Alyssa closed the book in her hand, still smiling politely. "How can we help you?" Mary Ann bowed, her voice steady. There is a slight mistake. The passenger Mrs. Langford here wants to sit next to her husband, Mr. Langford, who is in business class. Your seats are the closest. If you two could change seats, we would appreciate it." Alyssa smiled and tilted her head slightly. "Thank you. But we have reserved this seat in advance and want to sit together." "I'm afraid we can't change it." Mary Ann kept smiling, but looked a little embarrassed. "Mrs. Langford interrupted, her voice soft but commanding. "My husband needs me by his side. Ma'am, he doesn't like flying alone." "I'm sure you understand," Devon said softly. "We understand. But I think the airline can find another seat in business class. Or another empty seat for you, Mrs." Langford frowned, then said to Mary Ann, loud enough for several people around to hear, "This is what I say all the time, these people. Never cooperate." The air suddenly stopped. The sound of the fan was still steady, but it seemed like every breath in the cabin had slowed down. These people. The two words were as light as wind, but fell like stones. Alyssa blinked and looked up. In the dim light of the cabin, she saw Mary Ann's fake smile stiffen. Devon said nothing. He just tilted his head and looked straight at Memke. Langford, not angry, not challenging, but asking, "What did you just say, Mrs.?" Langford dodged, adjusting her scarf. Mary Ann quickly interjected, "Sorry, there must have been a misunderstanding. Mrs. Langford is just a little nervous before the flight." Alyssa kept her voice soft. "But clear, I understand stress. But I don't think stress makes people say things like that." A few passengers in front turned back. A middle-aged couple exchanged a glance, then fell silent. No one wanted to intervene, but no one looked away either. A strange feeling spread, the feeling when justice has not spoken, but everyone can hear it waiting. Devon opened his phone and quickly dialed. He spoke softly, as if calling an acquaintance. "Hello. This is Devon Carter, Sky Vista 482 passenger, row 14A. I would like to report a discriminatory behavior just before takeoff." His voice was low, slow, and calm. No one shouted. No one responded. There was such silence that Mary Ann could feel her heart pounding. "Mrs." Langford turned away, trying to hide her embarrassment, but her words still hung in the air like an unbridgeable rift. Alyssa looked at her brother, her eyes softening. Deep inside, she heard her mother's words. "You don't need to shout to be heard. Let the truth speak for you." From the back seat, Howard Ellis. The old man they had just met at the departure gate leaned forward slightly. He said nothing, just looked at Mary Ann, then at Devon, nodding slowly. Mary Ann stood still. She felt the eyes of dozens of people on her. She was the one with power in the cabin, the one who could make demands, who could give orders, but right now, that power seemed to be slipping away. Alyssa spoke softly, her voice not loud, but enough to carry far. "We will sit in our seats. If the airline needs confirmation, please contact us after landing." Devon closed his phone and calmly placed it on the table. He looked up, a small but firm smile on his face. "We'll be here, like the ticket says, like we paid for, like every other passenger." The cabin was silent. Outside, afternoon light streamed through the windows, reflecting off the metal floor, dividing the cabin in half, one light, one dark. In that moment, Howard Ellis whispered to himself, "The world is not changed by shouting, but by people like them staying put." Mary Ann did not reply. She drew back, bowed slightly, and turned away. Mrs. Langford stood still, her lips pressed together. No one said anything more, but the whole cabin sensed that something had happened, a small thing, but real. Devin leaned back in his chair and closed his eyes. Alyssa continued to look out the window. Outside, the sky was a pale blue, as if it had never known boundaries, and somewhere, inside her, a strange feeling arose, not anger, but clarity sometimes. Simply holding her own was the strongest action. The atmosphere in the cabin was still as tense as a string that was not yet ready to snap. Marianne stood still, her hand clutching her notebook, her eyes scanning the room for a way out of a situation that had just exceeded the service model she knew by heart. Mrs. Langford turned away, her lips pressed together, her gaze darting quickly toward the business-class cabin, as if her husband's presence would put things right again. Then an old man's voice, deep and warm, rang out from behind. "Excuse me if I can contribute a small solution." Everyone turned. Howard Ellis, still composed, was standing up from row 15C. He gave a small smile, enough to ease the tension, and said, "I can move up to row 14. I don't mind. It seems like everyone will be more comfortable that way." Marianne felt rescued from the storm. "You are very kind, sir." "Howard," he corrected softly. "It's just Howard." He turned to Devin and Alyssa. "Do you two mind if I sit with you?" Devin nodded slightly. "Not at all. Thank you." Alyssa smiled, a small but grateful smile. "Actually, having you here makes us feel more comfortable." Marianne was embarrassed by this remark. She nodded and stepped back. "Mrs. Langford pursed her lips, though reluctantly. "Well, then, all right. I don't want to be a bother." But everyone heard in her voice forced concession, not sympathy. Howard moved up to row 14C, between the Carter brothers and the aisle. He gently placed his hat on his lap, his eyes still calm. Marianne adjusted her dress and said quickly, "Thank you for your cooperation. I will inform the chief flight attendant so the flight can take off." Then she turned and left, walking a little hurriedly, as if leaving behind something she no longer wanted to touch. The cabin began to hum again, hushed voices drifting through the air. The tension eased, but it didn't disappear. It just lingered in the air, waiting for an opportunity to rise again. Howard looked at Alyssa, his eyes deep and gentle. "You did the right thing. No need to raise your voice. Just keep your place. People will have to look at how you kept quiet." "Thank you," Alyssa replied, her voice soft but full of emotion. "Actually, I just try not to lose my temper." Howard nodded. "I've spent my whole life learning that, and I'm still not really successful." Devin chuckled. "Maybe no one is completely successful." "Howard, but at least you saved the flight today." Howard responded with a mischievous frown. "Help, I just don't want to read the paper in that atmosphere. The stress gives me a headache." The three of them laughed, the sound small but enough to make a few people behind them smile as well. The moral storm seemed to have receded, giving way to the warmth between strangers. However, Alyssa's heart was still not completely at peace. She felt that something was not done. The words these people still echoed in her mind, no longer as an insult, but as a scratch reminding her that the gap between us and them still existed even in the most luxurious cabins of the 21st century. Devin looked at his sister, as if he understood. He spoke softly, just enough for the two of them to hear. "Don't let one word cloud our goal. We're going home. Remember," Alyssa nodded slightly, "home, where no one can say I don't belong." Howard glanced over at that. He nodded in agreement. "You're right. Belonging sometimes just needs to be redefined and then shared more widely. I think that's what you're doing." The plane began to pull away from the gate, slowly taxiing down the runway. Through the window, the Seattle sunset dyed the glass golden, reflecting on the faces of 3 people, 3 generations, 3 stories, but the same lesson. Marianne returned to the cabin, checking for safety. Her eyes lingered on row 14. Something about the way they sat so calm, so still made her feel a little self-conscious. She didn't know why, but for the first time on her shift, she felt the need to think about something bigger than passenger procedures. As the plane took off, Devon glanced out the window, where the last light of day was fading. Alyssa placed her hand on the book she had brought with her, The Long Way Home, and suddenly thought that perhaps every journey home was actually a journey to find dignity in this prejudiced world. Howard opened the small notebook and wrote a few lines in shaky handwriting. Justice needs no sound. Sometimes, just one person sitting in the right place is enough to make the system stop to breathe. He smiled, then looked at the 2 young people. I have a feeling this flight is going to be longer than expected, he said. Devon laughed. I hope it's not for technical reasons, Howard replied, half joking. No, just because I think something is being done to see what people learn from being reminded of fairness. Alyssa looked at him for a long time. There was a light of gratitude in her eyes, not just because he had stood up to help them, but because he had done it without any sense of salvation, simply as someone who chose to stand on the right side. The plane began to climb. Seattle was a patch of light below them, and above them, the clouds were spreading like white ribbons. Devon let out a small sigh, the breath of someone who had just survived a small ordeal, but he knew it wasn't over. And so it is. At the front of the cabin, Marianne was talking to a younger flight attendant. Her voice was low, but her eyes showed concern. She had just received a message from business class. Mrs. Langford had complained that today's flight had problems with service and the attitude of black passengers. Howard looked down the aisle, sensing the change in the air again. He quietly closed his notebook. The first gust of wind had just passed, and the sky was preparing for the next Devon. Alyssa, neither of them knew that his call and the actions of the old man beside him were only the prelude to a greater test of faith, wisdom, and justice. Sky Vista Flight 482 had stabilized its altitude. The steady sound of the engines was like background music that no one paid attention to anymore. The fasten seat belt sign had turned off. Passengers began to relax. Some opened their laptops. Some ordered drinks. The atmosphere seemed to have returned to peace. Alyssa took out her book and continued reading. Devon opened his laptop and checked some blueprints. Howard closed his eyes and rested his hands on his knees, seemingly resting. Everything seemed to be over, but sometimes the most dangerous thing is not the storm, but the calm before it. About 20 minutes later, Marianne returned. Her eyes were troubled, but her voice was restrained, colder than before. With her was a young stewardess, black, in her 20s, petite, with a name tag that read, Tiana Brooks. Alyssa raised her head slightly. She immediately recognized the tension in Marianne's steps and Tiana's slow, forced bow. She understood something was coming. "Excuse me, ladies and gentlemen," Marianne began, her voice a carefully rehearsed professional one. "I just received word from business class. Mrs. Langford has a medical condition and needs to be seated near her husband for medical assistance if needed. As a result, we have been forced to ask you to move seats." Devon looked up. "Medical reasons?" "Yes," Marianne said quickly. "Specifically, Mrs. Langford has a history of heart problems, and the crew had to ensure the safety of the passengers. Alyssa looked to the front row, where Mrs. Langford sat. She was reading a magazine, her legs crossed, her face showing no signs of needing medical attention. "She looks fine," Alyssa said softly. Marianne squeezed his hand. "It is not my duty to discuss diagnoses with passengers. Ma'am, I am just doing my job." The atmosphere was tense. Tiana stood beside him, her eyes downcast, her hands clasped together. She avoided Alyssa's gaze. It seemed like she knew this was wrong, but had no right to speak up. Devon leaned back in his chair, his voice still calm, but lower, deeper. "So if I understand correctly, Sky Vista Airlines is using unverified medical reasons to force passengers to change seats to someone with more privileges." "Right," Marianne took a deep breath, trying to keep her voice even. "I'm trying to avoid having to call security, sir." The sentence, though said calmly, carried the weight of a threat. A few passengers around started to turn back. Alyssa put down her book, her eyes stopping on Tiana's face. "Are you the one who confirmed this medical reason?" Tiana shook her head slightly, her voice as small as the wind. "I was only asked to go with Sister Marianne." Howard opened his eyes. He looked at Marianne, then slowly unbuckled his seatbelt. "Ma'am, if it is indeed a medical issue, it would probably be best to call airport paramedics before takeoff. As a former law professor, I remember the rule: if a passenger is in a dangerous condition, the flight cannot continue without medical clearance." The whole compartment fell silent. Marianne paused, her eyes wavering. She had not expected the gentle old man behind her to know the law, and to quote it so accurately. Devon tilted his head slightly. "Thank you. Howard." Howard nodded. "I'm just telling the truth. And Marianne, I know you're under pressure, but sometimes keeping silent is complicity. Be careful with that." Marianne swallowed. A bead of sweat fell on her temple. Despite the cool cabin temperature, Tiana stood still, eyes wide. For a few seconds, time seemed to stand still. Then Marianne exhaled and said softly, "I will tell the captain." She turned and left, Tiana following quietly. As they were gone, Howard spoke softly, as if to Devon and Alyssa. "There are two kinds of people in this world: those who sit still because they are afraid, and those who sit still because they know they don't have to be afraid." Alyssa looked at him, her eyes sparkling. "Which type are you?" "Howard." He smiled. "I'm old. I belong to the third type. People who are no longer afraid of being misunderstood." Devon chuckled, though the situation wasn't over. He closed his laptop and looked out the window. The sky was still clear, the sunset still beautiful, ironically. The outside world was oblivious to the injustice quietly being repeated here, in a steel box 10,000 feet above the ground. A few minutes later, Marianne returned. Tiana was gone. Her eyes were now filled with frustration and concern. "Captain Morgan has received the information. He will contact you directly after reviewing the medical report." "Thanks." Devon replied. "We're ready." Alyssa looked straight at her. "Marianne, I hope when this is cleared up, you'll remember sometimes. Due process doesn't mean right." Marianne was silent, then turned away. Howard looked on, then muttered, "I've been teaching all my life, but I've rarely seen a moral lesson written in the sky like this." Devon chuckled. "And we are the illustration." The air slowly quieted, but no one felt truly at ease. Alyssa felt her heart pounding, not from fear, but because she understood that what was happening was far more than a seat-sitting argument. It was proof that prejudice could disguise itself as rule, and that small power could become a weapon in the wrong hands. Howard tilted his head toward her and said softly, "You know, Alyssa, I've seen this happen many times. No need to scream, no need to argue. As long as the light shines long enough, the darkness will reveal itself." Alyssa smiled, her eyes softening. "Yes, but sometimes light needs to start with someone daring to flip the switch." Devon glanced at her, unspeakably proud. He opened his phone and saved a note, "Skyvista Flight 482, incident report pending." A small line, but contains all the power of wisdom instead of anger. Outside, the plane was still flying steadily. No one said anything more. But in their hearts, the three of them, Howard, Alyssa, and Devon, all knew that the biggest wave was yet to come. And this time, justice won't need a scream. Just the truth will ring long enough. The cabin was filled with a tense silence. The steady hum of the engines outside sounded like the heartbeat of a great beast trying to keep calm. Everyone seemed to be waiting for something, an answer, an action, or perhaps someone brave enough to say what they dared not. Mary Ann returned to row 14 with the young co-pilot. She held a piece of paper in her hand, probably a memo from business class. "Mrs." Langford sat in the front, glancing back with satisfaction, as if waiting for her own justice to be served. Alyssa squeezed Devon's hand under the table, signaling calm. Howard remained seated, but his eyes had changed, no longer the gentle, affable old man's. They were sharp, like a knife sharpened after years in its sheath. Mary Ann took a deep breath, then said, "Mr. and Mrs. Carter, I have received reconfirmation from passenger Langford. We are advised to rearrange seating due to a potential medical condition that may before he could finish his sentence." Howard Ellis slowly stood up. He was not tall, but his posture silenced the entire row of seats behind him. He turned around, his voice not loud, but clear and resonant, like the hammer in a courtroom. "Miss Mary Ann, I ask you to stop, and I also request that the captain be notified immediately." Mary Ann started. "Sir, this isn't none of my business," Howard interrupted, his voice calm but strangely authoritative. "I've heard that 1,000 times. You know. When people witness injustice and choose to remain silent, I've lived long enough to know that silence is sometimes worse than wrong." All eyes turned to him. A few passengers took out their headphones. A few looked up from their phones. The cabin grew quiet. Howard looked around, then continued, each word falling slowly, low and steady. "My name is Howard Ellis. Many years ago, I was a civil rights lawyer, working on anti-segregation cases in Alabama and Louisiana. I represented passengers who were removed from their seats just because they were the wrong color." The words were like a bolt of electricity that pierced the thick air of the cabin. Mary Ann took a half step back, her eyes wide. Devon and Alyssa looked at him. For the first time they recognized in his aged voice something unlearned, the authority of true justice. Howard continued, "If there is a medical reason, the airline must have medical evidence. If not, this is discrimination disguised as passenger care, and I have an obligation, not just to these two people, but to all passengers, to stop the flight until this is clarified." The murmurs spread like ripples. A middle-aged man in row 12 spoke up. "He's right. If there really was a medical problem, why didn't they prepare for it in advance?" Another woman said softly, "She looks fine. She even ordered some wine." Mary Ann paled. She tried to keep calm, but her voice trembled. "Mr. Ellis, I will have to report you for interfering with flight operations." Howard looked at her directly, cutting her off again. "You don't need to file a report. I'll do it for you, directly with Skyvista's legal department. I used to work with the Civil Air Rights Committee, which still monitors aviation ethics violations. Believe me, you don't want your name on that report. The air broke. Murmurs filled the cabin. A young passenger held up his phone, probably recording. Marianne saw it, but did not dare to ask him to stop. Alyssa turned to Devon and said softly, "He is doing what we cannot." Devon replied softly, "No, he is doing what his generation paid for, so we can sit idly by." Howard turned back to look at the Carter brothers. He nodded, his eyes softening. Justice doesn't need arguing. Just stand up when someone tries to sit it down. Marianne awkwardly pulled out her walkie-talkie and lowered her voice. "Cockpit, this is the chief flight attendant. I need the captain to come out and talk directly." The co-pilot left quickly, leaving Marianne standing in the middle of the cabin, alone, exposed to the gazes of dozens of people. Mrs. Langford, who had been silent the entire time, was no longer calm. She glanced around, feeling the eyes on her. Howard sat down slowly. He spoke softly, almost in a whisper. "I've seen this many times, but it always reminds me of... One day in 1964, a black woman was asked to give up her seat on the bus. They said it was for the convenience of others." "We know her name, right?" Alyssa replied softly. "Rosa Parks." Howard nodded. "Yes, and she just sat there, like you two just did." Sometimes silence is the loudest scream. At that moment, Captain Avery Morgan, the captain, stepped out of the cockpit, a middle-aged, brown-skinned man, with a dignified appearance and alert eyes. He looked around, immediately sensing the tension. "What's going on here?" Marianne hurried to explain, but her voice was off. Howard quietly raised his hand. "I'll keep this short. Captain, there was a request to change seats between passengers for fictitious reasons, disguised as medical reasons. I'm requesting a temporary grounding to ensure transparency." Captain Morgan looked around, then looked straight at Howard. "Your name is?" "Howard Ellis, retired civil rights lawyer." There was a pause. Captain Morgan's eyes wavered. He had heard the name somewhere, an old newspaper article, or a record of the civil rights movement. He turned to Marianne, his voice stern. "I want a full report after the flight. Marianne, now. I will verify it myself." Howard nodded slightly, then looked at Devon and Alyssa. "Justice doesn't leave the cabin. Kids, it just waits for someone to call its name." Devon squeezed his hand. "Thank you, Howard. You have no idea how much this means." The old man smiled. "Believe me, I know, because someone did it for me 60 years ago." The captain left, Marianne following, her figure small in the dim light. The cabin was still silent, but it was no longer a silence of fear. It was a silence of respect. Alyssa looked out, where the clouds were cascading beneath her wings. She suddenly remembered what her mother had said. "Never let anyone define your worth by the chair you sit on." As for Howard, he closed his eyes and exhaled slowly. In the soft whistling of the wind outside the fuselage, he heard the echoes of the 1960s, the sound of leather shoes on the streets, people shouting "Justice now," and the images of faces once despised, now landmarks for humanity. This time, justice doesn't need a court. It just needs one old man to stand up and two young men to stay. The cabin was quiet, but no one was truly relaxed. Eyes were still on row 14, where 3 people from 3 generations sat silently, like a lake that had only just temporarily stopped rippling. Up ahead, Captain Avery Morgan returned to the cabin, his expression serious but not tense. The man had the gait of someone who had often been caught between justice and duty. He nodded slightly to Howard. then said in a low but clear voice, "Mr. Ellis, Miss Carter, Mr. Carter and Stewardess Brooks, please come up to the side deck. I need to talk to you directly." Mary Ann stood beside him, her eyes on the floor. She had not been invited. Howard slowly stood up, adjusting his jacket. Alyssa and Devon followed. Tiana, who seemed hesitant, but at Howard's gentle gesture, she followed. The hatch door closed, cutting them off from the noise of the passengers. In the small space with only 4 seats and a console, the engine's hum echoed through the steel like a steady heartbeat, cold but honest. Captain Morgan sat down, folded his arms across his chest. "First of all, thank you all for remaining calm," he began. "I would like to hear everything from the beginning, in order. Mr. Ellis, would you mind starting?" Howard nodded. He spoke briefly, clearly, detailing every detail from Mary Ann and Mrs. Langford's request to change seats, to the medical reasons given without any verification. He did not judge. He reported, but each sentence carried the weight of a witness who knew the law and people. When he stopped, Alyssa raised her head. She didn't argue, didn't accuse, just spoke in a soft but firm voice. "Captain, what pains me is not just the action, but the way it was wrapped up in procedure. Ms. Mary Ann didn't name her bias. She called it temporary health policy. That's the problem. Oftentimes, prejudice doesn't wear the uniform of hatred, it wears the vest of standards." Captain Morgan looked at her, his eyes thoughtful. He spoke slowly. "You are talking about camouflaged bias in the system." Alyssa nodded. "Yes. I do research on this at Stanford. People often don't realize that it's the most impartial processes that are the breeding grounds for bias, because it makes the people who carry it believe they're doing the right thing." Devon added, his voice calm but forceful. "We don't want to punish anyone. We just want the airline to know that silence in the face of small injustices corrupts the entire system. And I trust you don't want that happening on your flight." Captain Morgan leaned back in his chair, his hands clasped together. The pale yellow light from the console illuminated his face, revealing the wrinkles of someone who had seen too many fragile situations between people. He was silent for a few seconds, then turned to Tiana Brooks, who had kept her head bowed. "Miss Brooks, do you have anything to say?" Tiana swallowed, then nodded. Her voice was shaky but sincere. "Captain, I didn't confirm any medical reasons. I was just called in to assist in a seat change. I knew it was wrong, but I was scared. I was new. And honestly, when the request was from an older white passenger, and the request was from a black passenger, I knew I wasn't just between 2 seats. I was between 2 worlds. The air seemed heavier." Howard tilted his head slightly, his eyes filled with sympathy. Captain Morgan sighed. "Thank you for telling the truth, Miss Brooks," he said softly. "That courage is rare." Then he turned to Carter and Howard. "I will not let this go unnoticed. I will request an internal report as soon as I land in Phoenix, and I will make sure the airline knows this is not just a minor incident." Alyssa looked at him, her eyes softening. "Thank you, Captain. Not because we won, but because you listened." Howard smiled. "Sometimes, power is not shown by decisions, but by who we choose to listen to." The captain nodded, smiling slightly. "You're right. I've been flying for 20 years. But today is probably the first time I've seen justice sitting in the passenger seat." Howard chuckled. "Justice travels economy class, sir. It doesn't have a business budget." All 4 of them laughed. It wasn't loud, but it was enough to break the heavy atmosphere. Captain Morgan stood up, his voice more determined. "We'll figure it all out after we land. But rest assured from now on, no one will be asked to leave their seats Not one. Howard nodded, and Devon and Alyssa thanked him and left the cabin. Captain Morgan and Tiana were alone. He looked at her and said slowly, "You did the right thing, Brooks. Don't let your fear make you look like someone you don't want to be. The company needs people like you." Tiana nodded, tears falling silently. As they returned to the cabin, a few passengers clapped softly, no loud noise, no cheering, just a few slow, respectful claps. Mrs. Langford bowed her head, while Marianne avoided everyone's gaze. Devon sat down and gently took his sister's hand. "You know," he said, "wisdom not only keeps us from being angry, but also keeps us from becoming the very thing we hate." Alyssa looked out the window. In the sky, the last rays of sunlight poured down, dyeing the wings of the plane golden. She said softly, "Perhaps justice is not just about who is right and who is wrong, but who is willing to sit down and talk to each other." Howard nodded, his eyes shining with quiet conviction. "Justice is not a sentence. It is a conversation. And today, you have begun a conversation that my generation has long awaited." The plane continued toward Phoenix. Inside, the air felt lighter, but a subtle change was taking place in everyone. Because once the truth is told, it cannot be put back in its box. Howard opened his notebook and wrote, "The new generation doesn't need to protest in the streets for justice. They just need to dare to hold their place in the sky." And he knew that somewhere in life, people like Marianne would have to learn that lesson again, that sometimes keeping someone else's place is also keeping one's own dignity. Sky Vista. 482 was still gliding through the silvery clouds, its journey to Phoenix just over an hour away. But the atmosphere in the cabin was different now. No more tension, no more chatter. Instead, there was anticipation, waiting for the end of something bigger than a flight. When the fasten seatbelt sign briefly came on, Captain Avery Morgan stepped out of the cockpit. He adjusted his cap, his posture calm, but his eyes determined. The cabin was almost silent. Everyone knew this was no longer a private matter between a few passengers. He stopped in front of row 14 where Devon, Alyssa, and Howard sat. Marianne stood a few feet away, her expression a mix of worry and regret. Tiana Brooks stood beside the captain, her eyes cast down, but this time not out of fear, but out of respect. Captain Morgan took a deep breath, then spoke clearly enough for everyone in the cabin to hear, "I am Captain Avery Morgan of Sky Vista, Flight 482. After verifying and hearing the entire incident, I would like to formally apologize on behalf of the airline to the 3 passengers in row 14, Mr. Howard Ellis, Mr. Devon Carter, and Dr. Alyssa Carter for what just happened." A murmur spread through the cabin, then died away. No one, anywhere, should be questioned or asked to leave their seat because of the color of their skin, their gender, or their underlying prejudices, he continued, his voice low and firm. "In the sky, every passenger is equal, and it is my responsibility to ensure that not just with words, but with actions." Alyssa felt her nose sting. She looked at Devon, her brother sitting up straight, his eyes calm, but his hands clenched. Howard tilted his head, his eyes shining with an emotion he tried to hide behind his old smile. Captain Morgan turned to Marianne. "Chief Steward, Marianne has admitted her shortcomings in handling the situation. I appreciate her taking responsibility." Marianne bowed her head, her voice trembling. "I apologize to you all. I let my prejudices guide my actions, forgetting that my true duty is to serve people, not prejudices." Howard looked at her, nodding slightly. Admitting your mistakes doesn't make you any less. Marianne, it makes you human again. The air seemed to soften. Captain Morgan continued, Now, I have 3 options that need to be clarified before we proceed. 1, the flight will continue as planned, with all passengers remaining in their seats. No one forced to change seats. 2, if Langford passengers feel uncomfortable, we can arrange another flight for them. Once they arrive in Phoenix. 3, if the Carter family feels offended and wants to leave the flight mid-landing. The airline will cover all costs and compensation. The whole cabin fell silent again. All eyes turned to Devon and Alyssa. Alyssa turned to her brother and smiled slightly. I think we've had enough of moving chairs for today, Devon replied in a warm, humorous voice. Yeah, and I think there's room in the world for both of us, at least on this plane. He looked straight at the captain. We will stay, sir. Not because of this flight, but because of principle. If we leave every time we see injustice, then the unjust will never have to leave their seats. A burst of applause erupted from the back row. Then it spread throughout the cabin. Not loud, not wild, just the sound of sympathy, of belief that what was right still had a place in this world. Howard whispered, loud enough for only they to hear. You're right, Devon. Justice doesn't need a stage. It only needs an audience of conscience. Captain Morgan nodded, a smile flickering across his stern face. I respect your decision, and on behalf of the company, I will ensure that a full report is sent directly to the CEO's office. I will personally sign the report. Then he turned to the other passengers. Ladies and gentlemen, Sky Vista Airlines does not just carry people. We have a responsibility to carry their dignity. If anyone has forgotten that today, now is the time to remember. The whole cabin applauded again, louder and longer this time. A middle-aged man shouted, Bravo! Captain, and laughter broke out, relieving the remaining tension. Mrs. Langford sat still, her eyes averted. She said nothing. But in that moment, looking at the brown captain, the old white lawyer, and the 2 black brothers who were respected by the whole cabin, she realized her privilege had never been something she took for granted. It was something others had spent their entire lives trying to earn. As Captain Morgan left, Howard leaned slightly toward Tiana, who was standing nearby. Miss Brooks, he said, remember today, because someday you may be the one making the decisions. And I hope you choose like the captain people first, process second. Tiana nodded, her eyes sparkling. I will remember Mr. Ellis. Alyssa turned slightly to Howard, her voice low. You know, I think my mother would be proud to see this. She always said, don't try to win an argument. Win with character. Howard smiled, his eyes looking out the window where the sun was slowly setting in the west. Well, you just won today. Alyssa? Devon gently placed a hand on his shoulder. No, we all win your generation. And our generation. The plane continued its journey into the sunset. Outside, the orange clouds spread out like a giant silk cloth, welcoming a new day for humanity. A day when justice is no longer a distant story, but something people can see, right in the sky. When the landing signal sounded, Howard closed his notebook. He wrote the last line, justice doesn't fly first class. But today it landed safely. The plane cabin was quiet after Captain Avery Morgan's apology. But it wasn't a tense silence. It was a rare kind of silence. One where people sensed they had just witnessed something right happen in the sky. Where there are no courts, no judgments, just truth and courage. Howard looked around, seeing the changing faces. A middle-aged white man nodded at him, as if to say, I understand. An Asian girl smiled at Alyssa, her eyes full of sympathy. Marianne, who had started the chaos, stood still at the back of the car, her hands clenched, her face flushed partly from embarrassment, partly because she had just learned something she had never been taught in any training. Ethics isn't about process. It's about how people treat each other. Then suddenly, the plane's speakers came on. There was a slight crackle, and Captain Morgan's voice echoed through the cabin, low and calm, but with something that made the listener's heart stop. To all passengers of Sky Vista Flight 482, he began, I would like to send an official message, not just as a captain, but as a human being. Everyone looked up. Absolute silence. In the sky, there is no class higher than human dignity. No one should be made to feel inferior because of the color of their skin, their origin, or the way others see them. Starting today, Sky Vista Airlines officially implements a policy of zero tolerance for discrimination. No tolerance for any discrimination, whether in words, actions, or even in the smallest decisions. The loudspeaker boomed, each word as heavy as the gavel of justice. Howard looked at Devon and Alyssa, his eyes shining with indescribable joy. We, the people who serve you, are not only responsible for the safety of our passengers, Captain Morgan continued, but also for protecting what makes us different from machines, our humanity. If anyone, in any position in this airline, forgets that they will have no place in Sky Vista. There was a moment of silence. Then, from the middle row, a single clap. No one knew who started it, but within seconds, the entire cabin was clapping. It was loud, powerful, and genuine. No one cheered. No one shouted, just a common feeling. It was the right thing to do. Alyssa turned to Devon and whispered, Do you feel like you just witnessed a historic moment? Devon chuckled, I think we just helped create it. Howard said nothing. He just put his hand to his heart and closed his eyes. That applause, it reminded him of 1964 when he was a young man, standing among hundreds of people marching for equal rights. They, too, had dreamed of a day when justice would not take to the streets, but would soar so high with the people. And today, it had happened. Captain Morgan continued speaking through the loudspeaker, his voice shaking a little, not with fear, but with emotion. Ladies and gentlemen, I believe that justice does not belong to anyone. It belongs to the moment when people choose right over easy. And I am proud that today, that moment happened on our flight. Another round of applause, longer and louder, echoed through the closed space of the passenger compartment. Some wiped away tears, some nodded, and some, like Mrs. Langford, were silent, but their eyes were less proud and more thoughtful. The captain concluded, Thank you all for being a part of this flight. And if anyone asked me what justice looks like, I would say, it looks like this cabin, right now, where people are not divided by skin color, but by respect. The loudspeaker cut off, but no one said anything for a long time. No one wanted to break the sacred atmosphere. Devon leaned back and whispered to his sister, Sometimes an apology doesn't change the past, but it opens up the future. Alyssa nodded, and today's future is flying with us. Howard looked out the window, where the sky had turned the color of copper and orange at sunset. Justice is something that rarely arrives in time, but when it does, it always manages to leave people speechless. He said slowly, In the back row. Marianne took off her name tag and looked at it for a long time. She knew that when she landed, she would have to write a report, face her superiors. But in that moment, she also knew that she had been saved not by her superiors, but by the lesson she herself had refused to learn. Tiana turned to Howard and said softly, "You know, I used to think justice was such a big thing. But now I think maybe it starts with the little things like not turning away when someone is being treated unfairly." Howard smiled. "That's right, girl. And today, I chose not to turn away. 3 generations the old white man, the 2 black brothers, and the young stewardess sat silently under the afternoon sky. Each carried something new, not a victory, but an awareness. Outside, the sky was open, vast and calm. Inside, hearts had just been through a storm not loud, but enough to wash away the dust that people call prejudice. As the announcement of the descent began, Devin looked out the window and whispered, "I think if the world is a long-haul flight, then justice is the pilot we should trust." Alyssa smiled, her eyes shining with confidence, and each of us, sometimes, just needs to be a passenger who knows how to keep our rightful place. Howard nodded slightly, his eyes filling with tears. Keeping your place is sometimes the most revolutionary act. Outside Dignity, dusk blanketed the Phoenix sky, a new day of realization beginning, not just for the 3 people in row 14, but for everyone who witnessed it. After the captain's announcement, the atmosphere in the cabin was still filled with emotion, as if they had just survived a short but intense summer rain. The late sunlight slanted through the windows, illuminating the passengers' cheeks, their eyes, both ashamed and awakened. Elena Langford, the woman who had once made the cabin so tense it was breathless, sat still for a long time. She looked at her hands, her aged fingers still wearing the old gold wedding band. The pale gold reflected off the leather seat, touching the image of Alyssa Carter sitting in front of her. She hesitated. Something inside her was nagging a feeling of unease mixed with curiosity, as if she herself wanted to understand why she was reacting this way. Finally, she took a deep breath and stood up. Her shoes clicked softly on the floor. A few passengers watched, wondering what she was up to. Alyssa was reading a book when she heard a soft voice beside her, "Miss Carter." Alyssa looked up. The voice was different, no longer haughty, no longer commanding. It trembled slightly, like someone learning to speak the truth. "Yes, Mrs. Langford." Elena pursed her lips slightly. She held the ring in her hand and turned it around. "I want to apologize for what I said earlier. I think I didn't realize that sometimes. The smallest things hurt the most." Devin glanced over, but Alyssa just placed her hand on his, as if to signal that everything was okay. Alyssa smiled slightly. "Thank you. We appreciate it." There was a pause. Elena looked at the ring in her hand, then said, "This ring has been in my family for 3 generations. It belonged to my grandmother, a woman who lost everything to war, but still believed in the goodness of people. She always told me, when you think you're better than someone, remember that sometimes they're the ones who help you up." Devin leaned back, his voice deep. "That was a beautiful lesson. Your grandmother is probably smiling today because she did what many people spend their entire lives unable to do: start again." Elena chuckled. "Maybe. What are you reading?" Alyssa held up the book in her hand. "The Long Way Home. This is one of my favorites," she said. "It's about a woman who has to learn to reclaim her humanity after society has turned her cruel." Elena nodded, staring at the title as if reading her own story. Sounds timely. Howard, who had been sitting next to him, had been silently observing, and now spoke softly. "The interesting thing about long journeys is we never go it alone. Sometimes God sends a stranger to remind us that we still have a way back. Elena turned, her eyes moist. "Do you really believe that?" Howard smiled, his voice hoarse but warm. "After 60 years of watching people make the same mistakes over and over again, I believe that every time someone says sorry, the world moves an inch toward the light." The cabin remained quiet. The engine noise became the background music for conversation. There were no barriers, no them and us, just people trying to understand each other. Alyssa told Elna about the research she was doing at Stanford and about the struggles women of color in academia still face to be recognized. Elna recounted the years when her husband, a conservative businessman, didn't believe in the concept of gender equality. They laughed as they discovered they had once been on opposite ends of the same fear of being seen as inadequate. Devin enters the conversation with a mundane detail. "I'm an architect, designing community centers. I've always believed that if people sit in a room together long enough, prejudices will dissolve." Elena looked at him, her eyes shining. "Maybe that's why God put us together in this hidden compartment in the sky. No one can hide." Howard laughed. A great sociology lesson, and Alyssa didn't need to lecture to get it across. Alyssa smiled and shook her head. Sometimes, to convince someone, you don't need reasoning, just the presence of sincerity. Elna bowed her head slightly. "And you did it. You both did it." In that moment, the atmosphere slowed down. No more engines, no more whispers. Only the fading light of dusk fell on their faces. 3 people, 3 pasts, 3 skin colors, but they all shared one thing. The ability to admit mistakes is not a sign of weakness, but a sign of true strength. Howard spoke slowly, as if summarizing the moment. Justice is not just the end of injustice. It is the beginning of understanding. Elena smiled, gently holding Alyssa's hand. "Perhaps today. I have traveled a long distance on my own journey back home." Alyssa returned the look with a gentle look. "Welcome back, Mrs. Langford." Howard looked out the window. The afternoon sun reflected off the sky. The clouds seemed to be parting, giving way to the distant land. He spoke softly, his voice almost a prayer. "It's strange, just a short conversation. People can see the humanity in each other, and that's what gives humanity hope." Devin added softly, "Once you see the human side of another person, you can never look at them the same again." The 3 were silent. Outside, Sky Vista 482 continued its journey, but inside, 3 hearts found peace without landing. Devin's words seemed to hang in the air. Sky Vista 482 continued to glide through the silver clouds, the cabin quiet but no longer heavy. Elena Langford remained seated next to Alyssa, her hands clasped in her lap, her face a picture of an internal struggle. She couldn't quite name regret or curiosity. After a few minutes of silence, Elena spoke softly, her voice trembling but firm. "Miss Alyssa, can I ask you something?" Alyssa looked up and smiled slightly. "Of course, Mrs. Langford?" Elena looked at her, then sighed. "You said something about unconscious bias earlier. I've heard that phrase many times. But honestly, I never understood why people like me are considered privileged. I don't have it easy. I work hard, take care of my family, and I'm also looked down upon by people who are richer than me. So, what's privileged about me?" Alyssa closed the book, her voice soft, not like a professor, but like a sister sharing. "You're right, no one should be defined by one word. Privilege doesn't mean you haven't had your share of struggles. It just means there are things you don't have to worry about that other people have to deal with every day. Like you can board an airplane without fear of being questioned because of the color of your skin. Or when you complain, Others see it as a right to be heard, whereas when people like me complain, sometimes they label me as emotional, troublemaking. Elena was silent. The words were not an accusation, but a mirror placed before her. She nodded slightly, then replied, "I guess I understand that. But sometimes, the way people talk about privilege makes people like me feel attacked. I know it's wrong to judge you based on your appearance, but I've also seen people use it as a way to accuse rather than connect. It makes me defensive." Alyssa was silent. The statement touched a nerve. "You're right," she said softly. "I've spent years studying inequality, but sometimes, in real conversations, I forget that knowledge isn't enough. I forget that not everyone is willing to listen, especially when they feel criticized. Maybe I need to learn how to combine knowledge with emotion to speak without making others feel small." Elena smiled slightly. "And I need to learn to listen without taking it as a threat." Howard, who was sitting next to her, broke the silence with a small laugh. "You know, what you just did, the whole Congress couldn't have done in years. Speak the truth to each other without arguing." Alyssa and Elena both laughed. The tension dissipated like smoke after rain. Howard continued, "Language is a double-edged sword. The same word, spoken with the heart, can heal. Spoken with pride, it can cut." Elena looked at him, then back at Alyssa. "Perhaps I used words as armor to hide my fear of being outdated. As for you, you used knowledge as a sword to fight against your fear of being looked down upon." Alyssa looked at her for a long time, then nodded. "Maybe we're all learning to put them down." "Right." Elena gently held Alyssa's hand, her voice small but sincere. "I'm not sure I will change completely, but at least I will start by asking more than judging." Alyssa smiled. "And I would start by listening even when others are wrong, because maybe they just haven't heard anyone gentle enough to help them be right." Across the aisle, Devon watched the two women converse, then leaned over and said to Howard, "I guess justice sometimes doesn't need a court. It just needs two people brave enough to tell the truth." Howard smiled slightly, his eyes distant. "Justice begins with understanding, but to go further, it requires humility." The plane continued to soar through the sea of clouds, the sunlight gradually turning a pale orange. In that narrow cabin, there were no winners, no losers, just two people who had just found better versions of themselves, Alyssa said softly. As if in conclusion, "Mrs. Langford, you know, people often think the biggest battle in the world is between skin colors, but actually, it lies between ego and compassion." Elena nodded, her voice as light as a breath. "And I think, today, compassion just scored a point." Howard chuckled, leaning back, his eyes fixed on the window where the last streaks of dust stretched. "If everyone could talk like this," he said slowly, "the world wouldn't need so many courts." The steady hum of the plane's engines mingled with the peaceful atmosphere. That conversation was not recorded in the news, not live-streamed, not shared on social media, but it was enough to change three people, and sometimes the world begins to change from a small compartment in the clouds. Elena Langford's soft, breathy voice faded into the distance, along with the steady hum of the engines. The last light of day, almost gone, shone through the small window, creating a thin golden stripe on the cabin floor. It felt like the world had shrunk just the people in Sky Vista 482, floating among the clouds, sharing a fragile peace that few could touch. Howard Ellis leaned over, looking at both women before him, his eyes both kind and penetrating. He spoke slowly, each word falling like small pebbles on the surface of a pond. You know, progress is not a straight line. It is not a path from error to perfection. It is a series of loops. People stumble, learn, stumble again, but each time they fall a little higher. Alana smiled sadly. You mean, we never really finish getting better? Howard nodded, his eyes narrowing in the soft light. That's right. Each generation thinks it has learned it all, only to have its children prove you've only just begun. What matters is not whether you're perfect, but whether you have the courage to keep speaking up when you see something wrong. Alyssa looked at him and nodded slowly. Like today. If no one spoke up, maybe everything would have passed, and injustice would be considered a small matter. Again. Howard chuckled, his voice hoarse but full of life. That's true. Every generation is better off if we don't keep quiet. But speaking out isn't about winning, it's about helping each other grow. Helena tilted her head, her eyes following Howard with respect. You sound more like a professor than a lawyer. Howard laughed. I taught law and sociology for a few years at Howard University. Then I did human rights, but now I teach the most important lesson. Tell the truth, but with kindness. The atmosphere lightened. Devon, who had been silent until now, joined in. Mr. Howard, if the world heard you speak every day, the meetings of Parliament would be much less noisy. Howard laughed. Oh no, Devon. If they invited me, I would just ask them to turn off the mic for 5 minutes to listen to each other. Alyssa smiled, then suddenly looked at Elena. You said you have a daughter who works in the social field. Right. Elena nodded, her eyes flashing with pride. Yes. Her name is Rachel Langford. She works at Westlake Community Services, a youth support center in South Phoenix. She always believed that people could change, if only given a chance. I always said she was too dreamy. Alyssa paused, smiling. Westlake. My boyfriend Daniel volunteers there every month. He teaches basic architecture to a group of homeless youth who want to learn the trade. Elena froze. You said, which Daniel Porter? Alyssa replied, her voice soft. He's an art teacher, but he also volunteers with the Build from Hope project. Helena chuckled, her hand lightly touching her chest as if she couldn't believe the coincidence. Oh my God! Rachel worked directly with him. She told me about a black guy who taught students how to build a house from a dream. I didn't expect him to be your boyfriend. Alyssa also smiled, her eyes shining with joy and emotion. Yes, it is him. Maybe this world is smaller than we think. Howard looked at the two of them, his eyes crinkling in a warm smile. It's not a small world. It's just that when you open your heart, you begin to realize that everyone is actually walking on the same network, just on different paths. Devon nodded. Like flight paths on a map, they look confusing on their own. But when seen from a distance, they connect the entire world. Howard tilted his head. And the beautiful thing is, we don't need to know everyone on this flight to do the right thing. We just need to trust that our kindness will touch someone. Somewhere. The way Alyssa and Elena just touched each other. Elena gently held Alyssa's hand again, her eyes no longer timid, but gentle like a family member. You know, maybe when I get back, I'll tell Rachel about this. She won't believe it. And I think she'll be very proud of me, not because I was right, but because I dared to listen. Alyssa smiled, her voice a touch soft. And I'll tell Daniel, too, it was your coworker's mother who made me believe that real conversation can change people. Howard leaned his hands on his knees, his voice deep and clear. "That's what makes me believe in humanity," he said. "We are never truly isolated, even when it seems like no one understands us. Somewhere we can connect sometimes through a stranger on the same plane." All four of them laughed, not loudly, but genuinely. Their laughter spread, blending with the fading golden light, making the cabin feel warm amidst the cold clouds. Howard looked at them, then said softly, as if to close the moment, "You know, progress is not about us going faster. It is about us going together, no matter how slow, no matter how stumbling, just not letting silence drown out the voice of conscience." Elena nodded, her eyes shining with gratitude. "Thank you, Howard. Thank you for making me reconsider everything I thought I knew." Howard smiled kindly. "It's nothing, Mrs. Langford. I'm just doing what my elders taught me: speak up when I see something wrong, but do it in the voice of someone who wants to heal, not condemn." Alyssa took his hand and said softly, "And that is what the world needs to learn again." Sky Vista 482 still glides through the clouds, but now, inside it, there are not just passengers waiting to land, but people who are on a much longer journey together, a journey of awareness, of connection, of wisdom. Howard Ellis's words echoed as Sky Vista 482 began its descent. Outside the window, the first rays of dawn over Phoenix tinged the long streaks of cloud with red, as if the sky itself were preparing for a change. The captain's voice came through the loudspeaker, deep and clear. "Dear passengers, we are now preparing to land at Phoenix International Airport. Thank you for flying with Sky Vista. We hope everyone has a meaningful journey, not just in the air, but in their hearts." Alyssa looked at Devon and smiled. They didn't say anything, but their eyes said it all. Things were different. Elena Langford adjusted her seat slightly. She looked around the cabin, which hours before had been filled with tension and cold stares. Now it was strangely quiet, as if everyone was in deep thought. Before the plane touched the runway, she leaned toward Alyssa. "Alyssa," she began, her voice low, "I know my apology wasn't enough. Maybe. No words were enough. But I want you to know I'm going to be thinking a lot about today, about myself, about how I let invisible biases dictate my actions." Alyssa smiled, slightly, as if afraid to break the moment. "We are all learning, Mrs. Langford. The important thing is that you looked back, something not everyone dares to do." Elena gently took her hand, saying nothing more. It was a brief squeeze, but it held more than any apology. The plane shook slightly as it touched down. There was a long, drawn-out sound of brakes. Then everything settled down. The captain announced that the plane had landed safely. Passengers began unbuckling their seatbelts, and luggage rattled in the cabin. As row 14 was about to leave, Mary Ann, the flight attendant who had caused the incident, walked over. Her expression remained professional, even a little cold. She stopped in front of Devon and Alyssa, her eyes not looking directly at them, but her voice low. "Thank you for your cooperation during the flight. I hope everything will be handled smoothly." Alyssa looked at her and nodded slightly. "I hope so too." No resentment, no challenge, just a calmness that made it impossible for the other person to deny their emotions. After a few seconds, Mary Ann bit her lip, then looked away. She might never admit her mistake in public, but that moment when her eyes averted was a realization, however small, that mattered. Behind Mary Ann, Tiana Brooks, a young black stewardess, approached. She looked at the Carter brothers, then gave a discreet nod. It was a quick nod, but her eyes were clear. A silent signal of support. Devon returned the gesture with an encouraging smile, without saying a word. As the group moved toward the exit, sunlight flooded the cabin. Howard Ellis stood slowly, leaning on his cane, and looked around. I've seen hundreds of trials, thousands of arguments, but few places have made me believe in people like this cabin today. Devon helped him get his luggage, smiling lightly. Maybe because here, no one can hide from each other. Howard nodded, smiling gently. That's right, Mr. Carter. And when you can't leave, you're forced to look back sometimes. That's the best thing for humanity. Elena stood beside him, smiling. I never thought I would find a lesson in humanity on a commercial flight. Howard turned to her, his eyes warm. The lesson is always there, Mrs. Langford. It just takes a little shaking sometimes to make us listen. As they stepped off the plane, bright lights greeted them. The atmosphere in the terminal was bustling, but it seemed like everything had slowed down for this group of people who had just taken a flight. Elena stopped and turned to Alyssa and Devon. Thank you both, she said sincerely. If you have the chance, I would like to invite you and him to my house for dinner. I would like Rachel to meet the people who changed her mother's perspective. Alyssa was touched. We are very pleased, and I think Daniel will be very happy to know this too. Elena laughed, her smile truly warm for the first time. So the world has become a little smaller. Howard stood beside her, shaking his head slightly. It's not any smaller. It's just that now you can't see how big it is. The three of them laughed. The airport loudspeakers blared out the usual announcements, but to them, every sound was gentle. Devon turned slightly to Alyssa. You know, what you said to Mrs. Langford on the plane about using knowledge and emotion? I think you did it. Alyssa smiled slightly, her eyes looking far away. Maybe, but it's just the beginning. True justice isn't an ending, but a series of new beginnings in every conversation, every choice. Howard heard nodding, and sometimes that beginning is simply not letting silence prevail. They stepped outside together, into the morning light of the city. The wind carried the heat of the Phoenix desert. But there was a different kind of warmth in their hearts, the kind that came from seeing others not by color, not by status, but by dignity. Behind her, Mary Ann remained in the compartment, looking out the door. Her eyes followed the three as they left. Then she let out a small sigh. No one heard it, but it could have been the first breath of regret, or at least the beginning of a thought. Meanwhile, Tiana helped an elderly passenger with a small smile. When she saw Devon in the distance, she raised her hand and waved slightly a small signal, but enough to say that not everyone in uniform looked the same. The final scene fades as the plane doors close. The sky outside is bright, and in each of us, Devon, Alyssa, Elena, and Howard, something has changed forever understanding, born of courage and kindness. From that moment, the Phoenix morning light poured into the arrivals area, golden and soft as forgiveness. The dry warmth of the desert filtered through the large glass panels, reflecting on the faces of those waiting for their loved ones. The air was noisy, bustling with loudspeakers, rolling luggage, children calling for their parents. But in the middle of that scene, there was a small corner that made people stop, a large sign held high. Welcome home, our pride. Alyssa laughed when she saw it. Devon shook his head slightly, embarrassed and proud. Behind the sign stood Mr. and Mrs. and Carter, their figures elderly, but their eyes still bright and loving. Mrs. Carter, in her old but neatly pressed floral dress, waved her hand and shed tears. Mr. Carter, tall and calm, held the sign high, his voice booming over the crowd. "Son, daughter." Welcome home. Alyssa and Devin hugged their parents, their laughter mixed with tears. The people around looked at them. Some smiled, some nodded. The happiness was simple but contagious. A moment later, Alyssa turned and pointed to Howard Ellis, who was still standing behind her, hat in hand, as calm as a grandfather watching his grandchildren reunite. "Mom, Dad, I want to introduce this is Mr. Howard Ellis. He was a human rights lawyer, and he helped us see something bigger on this flight. Mrs." Carter turned, her eyes filled with gratitude. "Mr. Ellis, thank you for being there for my children." Howard bowed his head slightly, his voice low and soft. "No, it is you two who make me believe that there is still hope in this world." "Mr. Carter extended his hand, the firm handshake of a seasoned man. "Do you have any plans today?" "Mr. Ellis, we are having a 50th wedding anniversary party at our house. We would be honored if you would come." Howard paused. He had attended hundreds of events in his life, from lavish weddings to humble funerals. But this invitation, so simple and so genuine, touched him. He smiled. "You're so kind. If you don't mind, I'd like to attend on one condition. I can't sit in the front row." "Mrs." Carter laughed, wiping away her tears. "No, Mr. Ellis. In our house, everyone is honored." Devin patted him on the shoulder. "You would get along great with my mother. She has whole shelves full of biographies of Martin Luther King and Maya Angelou." Howard laughed out loud, an old but lively laugh. "Then I must come. Looks like I found a place to read and discuss." They left the airport together, sunlight pouring down on the concrete floor, reflecting the harmonious footsteps of 3 generations old, young, white, black, walking side by side, without boundaries. In the car, Howard sat next to Mr. and Mrs. Carter, while Alyssa and Devin sat in the back. Mrs. Carter told the story, her voice bustling. "When we got married, we had nothing but our 2 hands and an old piano. But I always told my husband, if we can raise our children to love and stand up, that would be the best wedding gift in the world." Howard nodded. "She did more than that. She raised them to choose wisdom over anger, something that even many powerful people have not learned." The remark made Mr. Carter smile, his eyes looking into the distance. "We were afraid the world would hurt them. But today I am proud, because they chose to make peace, not to make trouble." The car stopped in front of a small house on the outskirts of Phoenix. The front yard was shaded by orange trees, neighbors gathered, and classic jazz played softly. A sign reading 50 Years of Love hung across the porch, and a long dining table covered with a white tablecloth sat below. Alyssa helped Howard out of the car, her voice gentle. "Mr. Ellis, welcome home. There are no guests here." Howard looked around, his eyes warm. "Then let me consider this my home. In the yard, the neighbors white, Mexican. Black all laughed and talked freely. A little girl ran up to give him a bouquet of jasmine flowers. "I heard you are a good person." Howard bent down and took it, his smile beaming. "Thank you, but I'm just lucky to have met other good people." The party began. There was clinking of glasses, storytelling, laughter, and the sound of guitars. Devin looked around and saw that Elna Langford and her daughter Rachel had arrived. She had kept her promise. Rachel was chatting happily with Daniel Porter, and Elena was chatting with Alyssa's mother. The whole scene felt like a genuine reconciliation, natural, without fanfare. Howard stood up and spoke briefly. He spoke not with a grandiose voice, but with simple truth. Some say the world is divided by differences, but today, I see the opposite. All it takes is a table, an invitation, and things begin to change. The whole stadium applauded, not in a ceremonial way, but in sympathy. Elena approached Howard and whispered, "You know, Mr. Ellis, I think I found the family I didn't know I needed." Howard smiled. "And I, Mrs. Langford, have met the generation I had hoped would continue our conversation." The party lasted until dusk, the sunlight falling on faces mingling with the music. A miniature world in that backyard where skin colors no longer contrasted, but merged through stories, smiles, and kindness. Howard sat silently for a moment, his eyes fixed on the flickering lights, then said softly to Devon, "You know, I thought I had come all the way to the end of my struggle for justice. But today, I realized, justice is really just a long table, where everyone sits down to eat, and no one is left behind." Devon nodded, looking at him with respect. "And you, Mr. Ellis, are the one who helped us set that table. The story ends with Mrs. Carter playing the piano, singing 'What a Wonderful World.'" Howard sings along softly, his voice low but steady. I see friends shaking hands, saying, "How do you do?" They're really saying, "I love you." And in that moment, no one said it, but everyone knew it. They had just witnessed what generations had dreamed of: a feast of justice, of compassion, and of people choosing wisdom over hatred. The party ended with laughter and warm yellow lights. As everyone began to clear the tables, Howard Ellis put on a light gray wool coat and walked slowly with Devon and Alyssa to the parking lot. The desert night air was cool, with a hint of orange from the backyard, and in the distance the city lights of Phoenix twinkled like falling stars. The three of them walked side by side, silent for a moment. Alyssa was the first to break the silence. "Mr. Ellis," she said softly, "what happened today, I think will stay with me for a long time, not just because of what happened on the plane, but because of what we found afterward." Howard laughed, his voice deep and tired, but still wise. "That's a good thing, Alyssa, because justice isn't really a judgment. It's a memory we choose to carry." Devon looked at him and nodded slightly. "You know, sometimes I think just one person standing up can change the atmosphere of the whole plane. But today I understand what's more important is who will stay in the seat, holding the seat for the right thing." Howard stopped, looked at the two young men before him, and then said slowly, his voice small but loud as the wind, "Keeping your seat is sometimes the most revolutionary act." Alyssa frowned slightly, wanting to ask. But Howard smiled and explained, "Because there are times when the world will tell you to stand up and make room for someone else, simply because they believe you don't deserve to sit there. And when you refuse to leave, not out of anger, but with dignity, that's when you're rewriting their rules." Devon was silent, his eyes distant. Then he said, as if responding with action, "Mr. Ellis, I'm designing a project in Eastfield, a new community center. I want it to be more than just a building, but a place where people, regardless of color or income, can come in and feel they belong." Howard tilted his head, interested. "A space to belong to? Tell me about it." Devon chuckled. "I want to open the main space, the living room, with no clear boundaries between the art area, the reading area, and the coffee area, so that people can meet by chance, talk, and share. Because sometimes justice doesn't need a big forum. It starts from a simple conversation between two strangers like that day, between us and Mrs. Langford." Alyssa smiled and continued her brother's words. I will help him make a community plan. How to get people from poor areas and middle-class areas to participate and make decisions together. Not giving favors, but building together. Howard looked at them, his eyes shining as if he were seeing his own youth again. He nodded slowly, his voice filled with emotion. You are doing what my generation could only dream of, he said. We fought to get a seat in the room. You are building that room and inviting everyone in. A pause passed. A gentle breeze blew, carrying the scent of jasmine from the backyard. Howard looked up at the night sky, where the Sky Vista plane was flying, its lights flickering like the blinking eyes of fate. He pointed up, his voice slow. Look, maybe someone is sitting in row 14 where you were. Maybe they are learning their own lesson. The journey of justice never ends. It just transfers from person to person, from seat to seat. Devin and Alyssa looked up at the same time. Under the night sky, the plane's path drew a thin line of light in the darkness, a breathtaking sight. Remember this, you two, Howard added, his voice low, almost as if he were telling him. That flight was delayed for a while, wasn't it? But it took off anyway. That's the way the world works. Progress may be slow, it may be delayed, but it continues conversation by conversation, action by action, person by person. Alyssa gently held his hand, her eyes filled with tears. I promise to continue speaking, to continue keeping my seat. Howard smiled and patted her shoulder. And remember, when necessary, invite others to sit with you. Devin laughed. Like you did to us today. That's right, Howard replied, his voice warming. Never sit alone in the chamber of reason. For when justice is alone, it becomes a monologue. But when two or three hear it together, it becomes a symphony. They reached Alyssa's car. Howard stood looking up at the sky one last time, his eyes deep but calm. It's strange, he said. I've been on thousands of flights, but this is the first time I feel like I've landed in the future. Devin opened the car door, smiling. Then you helped us take off. Mr. Ellis. Howard chuckled. No, you guys are the pilots. I'm just a passenger lucky enough to witness this flight. He walked away, his figure fading in the glow of the parking lot lights. Alyssa watched him, grateful. Devin said softly, almost to himself. He's right. Justice has no runway. It only has people who dare to hold their seats. The car rolled. Sam Cooke's A Change Is Gonna Come played on the radio. The soulful voice, combined with the dim light of the streetlights, reminded them of the flights, the conversations, the journeys they and the world were still on. Overhead, Sky Vista 483 flew by, its red and white lights flashing. Perhaps somewhere in the cabin, someone else was learning a lesson in patience, in dignity, in not leaving their seat just because someone told them they should. The journey to justice sometimes is that simple. No loud voices, no banners, just one person choosing to stay, keep the faith, and continue the dialogue. Because, as Howard Ellis said, keeping your seat is sometimes the most revolutionary act. And under the vast sky, as the plane's lights disappear behind the clouds, we understand that the flight may be delayed, but the journey continues. The party ended with laughter and warm yellow lights. As everyone began to clear the tables, Howard Ellis put on a light gray wool coat and walked slowly with Devin and Alyssa to the parking lot. The desert night air was cool, with a hint of orange from the backyard, and in the distance the city lights of Phoenix twinkled like falling stars. The three of them walked side by side, silent for a moment. Alyssa was the first to break the silence. Mr. Ellis, she said softly, what happened today? I think will stay with me for a long time, not just because of what happened on the plane, but because of what we found afterward. Howard laughed, his voice deep and tired, but still wise. That's a good thing. Alyssa, because justice isn't really a judgment, it's a memory we choose to carry. Devon looked at him and nodded slightly. You know, sometimes I think just one person standing up can change the atmosphere of the whole plane. But today I understand what's more important is who will stay in the seat, holding the seat for the right thing. Howard stopped, looked at the two young men before him, and then said slowly, his voice small but loud as the wind, keeping your seat is sometimes the most revolutionary act. Alyssa frowned slightly, wanting to ask, but Howard smiled and explained, because there are times when the world will tell you to stand up and make room for someone else simply because they believe you don't deserve to sit there. And when you refuse to leave, not out of anger, but with dignity, that's when you're rewriting their rules. Devon was silent, his eyes distant. Then he said, as if responding with action, Mr. Ellis, I'm designing a project in Eastfield, a new community center. I want it to be more than just a building, but a place where people, regardless of color or income, can come in and feel they belong. Howard tilted his head, interested. A space to belong to. Tell me about it. Devon chuckled. I want to open the main space, the living room, with no clear boundaries between the art area, the reading area, and the coffee area, so that people can meet by chance, talk, and share, because sometimes justice doesn't need a big forum. It starts from a simple conversation between two strangers like that day, between us and Mrs. Langford. Alyssa smiled and continued her brother's words. I will help him make a community plan. How to get people from poor areas and middle-class areas to participate and make decisions together, not giving favors, but building together. Howard looked at them, his eyes shining as if he were seeing his own youth again. He nodded slowly, his voice filled with emotion. Oh, you are doing what my generation could only dream of, he said. We fought to get a seat in the room. You are building that room and inviting everyone in. A pause passed. A gentle breeze blew, carrying the scent of jasmine from the backyard. Howard looked up at the night sky, where the Sky Vista plane was flying, its lights flickering like the blinking eyes of fate. He pointed up, his voice slow. Look, maybe someone is sitting in row 14 where you were. Maybe they are learning their own lesson. The journey of justice never ends. It just transfers from person to person, from seat to seat. Devon and Alyssa looked up at the same time. Under the night sky, the plane's path drew a thin line of light in the darkness, a breathtaking sight. Remember this, you too, Howard added, his voice low, almost as if he were telling him. That flight was delayed for a while, wasn't it? But it took off anyway. That's the way the world works. Progress may be slow, it may be delayed, but it continues conversation by conversation, action by action, person by person. Alyssa gently held his hand. Her eyes filled with tears. I promise to continue speaking, to continue keeping my seat. Howard smiled and patted her shoulder. And remember, when necessary, invite others to sit with you. Devon laughed, like you did to us today. That's right, Howard replied, his voice warming. Never sit alone in the chamber of reason. For when justice is alone, it becomes a monologue. But when two or three hear it together, it becomes a symphony. They reached Alyssa's car. Howard stood looking up at the sky one last time, his eyes deep but calm. "It's strange," he said. "I've been on thousands of flights, but this is the first time I feel like I've landed in the future." Devon opened the car door, smiling. "Then you helped us take off, Mr. Ellis?" Howard chuckled. "No, you guys are the pilots. I'm just a passenger lucky enough to witness this flight." He walked away, his figure fading in the glow of the parking lot lights. Alyssa watched him, grateful. Devon said softly, almost to himself, "He's right. Justice has no runway. It only has people who dare to hold their seats." The car rolled. "Sam Cooke's A Change Is Gonna Come" played on the radio. The soulful voice, combined with the dim light of the streetlights, reminded them of the flights, the conversations, the journeys they and the world were still on. Overhead, Sky Vista. 483 flew by, its red and white lights flashing. Perhaps somewhere in the cabin, someone else was learning a lesson in patience, in dignity, in not leaving their seat just because someone told them they should. The journey to justice sometimes is that simple. No loud voices, no banners. Just one person choosing to stay, keep the faith, and continue the dialogue. Because, as Howard Ellis said, keeping your seat is sometimes the most revolutionary act. And under the vast sky, as the plane's lights disappear behind the clouds, we understand that the flight may be delayed, but the journey continues.